Hi, I'm Jay Miskwick, Director and Translation Editor of Aliform Publishing, and we're going to continue with our discussion, Translation, Naming and Necessity. Today we're going to look at translation and interpretation, or perhaps what might be called the meaning of meaning. Translation is always a kind of interpretation. It's always a kind of mediation. The word interpretation comes from the Latin interpres, which means a negotiator or an agent or a mediator. And its derivative interpretare means to explain. Steiner says that every act of understanding is kind of actively interpretive. Translation is always subjective, no matter how much we would like it to be factual or independent. It's always impacted by our own ideas and thoughts, even feelings. The translator or the interpreter places herself between the original text and the reader. She takes something that's already been said and explains it, so to speak, in a new language. As far back as Aristotle, we learn that spoken words are the symbols of mental experience. I think too, when my own son, who grew up in a kind of multilingual environment, his mother is French, his stepmother is Spanish, I'm a native English speaker, and way back in the day when he was 3 or 4 years old, one day he said, "Dad, I can read." And he started sounding out the words on the page. And it wasn't a matter that he was recognizing the sound made by the letter. It was rather that he was recognizing the idea made by the sound. Steiner says that a definition of explanation is useful when we talk about translation. He says to explain a text is to paraphrase, transcribe, gloss it at the lexical, grammatical level, but also to understand it, to show how what was said was meant, and thus relations there may be between various different statements. The linguist Roman Jakobson says that giving meaning to a term is itself an act of translation. To give meaning to a term is an act of translation. The meaning of any linguistic sign, Jakobson says, is the translation into some further alternative sign, especially a sign in which it is more fully developed. Plain speaking, it takes words to explain words. It doesn't always take words, though, to explain ideas. I think back also to one of the most interesting and fruitful teaching experiences I ever had was when I taught preschoolers French at the Early Childhood Development Center at Hamline University in St. Paul many, many years ago. And I had the children for about an hour, 3 or 4 days a week, and made it a point never to speak English during that time. It was always using objects, using gestures, using motions, and saying the words aloud and getting the children to say the words while they were using the object, to hold a ball and to say, to make a phrase out of it, to hold a red ball and say ball rouge, to walk, to do gestures and say the words while they were doing the gestures without ever using the English language, without having them translate the word from French into English and then have that word in English register the idea. Just simply to take the idea and put it into those words. What is the meaning of meaning? Is the meaning of the sound red ball, that object, red ball? That is, what do we claim to do when we say a word means something? In part, certainly, it is the intention of the author, what the author proposes to convey, denote, signify through their use of language. What should be understood by the listener. And part of meaning is a should, an imperative. This should be, there is an intention, it's deliberate by the author. and this is part of that meaning amongst all other meanings. However, meaning isn't objective, but exists in the mind. It exists in the mind of the sender, the author, the speaker, but as importantly, it exists in the mind of the person receiving that message, in the reader, in the listener. Meaning, whether it's a singular idea or a cluster of qualities, a cluster of identities, a cluster of characteristics, emerges from a community of speakers. Saussure says that language never, even for a moment, exists except as a social fact. So again, there is inherent in meaning not only the personal intention, but kind of the unavoidable social context, larger context, community of speakers contexts that words have. All definitions, explanations, translations are essentially rephrasings and descriptions. Just think of the word meaning in and of itself. For example, we can say sense, signification, signified, purport, understanding, intent, aim, etc. We could go on with that list. So when we're taking a meaning from one language and putting it into another, one way we might conceptualize that meaning is thinking of it as a description of a thing, a description of a gesture, a description of a moment, a description of a characteristic or quality of a character's personality. Saul Kripke offers that a relevant definition of description is giving some condition which uniquely determines an object, then using a certain word as a name for the object determined by this condition. The condition of thirst, for example. Uniquely determines, Kripke says. Something may have all the properties by which we originally identified it, and yet still might not be that thing. So part of description isn't generalization. It's part of good description, part of even an intellectual description we have as we're trying to make that translation, is fixing a reference, fixing the reference. Make it discernible from all other such things that might also describe that term. Make the term you choose, the metaphor you choose, the phrase you choose, discernible, unique, different, more focused some way than other such possible descriptions. The referent is simply the thing named by a name or uniquely satisfying its description. So if A equals B, this word or phrase in one language, and this word or phrase in translated language, then Kripke says any essential property of one must be an essential property of the other. Things that are identical have all properties in common, but again, when we're going from one language to another, we're never going to have the same set of properties. We can't have the same set of properties because those languages emerge from different countries and cultures and periods of time and social events, etc. So they're never, except for at the most literal level, metaphor can never really be exact from one language to another because of those social differences. So if A and B are going to say or convey the same meaning, we don't necessarily need to have all the properties in the one word or phrase and from all the properties in the one word or phrase in the other, but its most essential qualities. What are the essential qualities, characteristics, synonyms that I can choose from, descriptions that I can choose from that's going to make my translation the most discernible, the most distinct from other possible translations while conveying the original meaning of that word or phrase. Identity has a few different things, aspects that we might consider with regard to identity, and identity and meaning and referentiality. The relation that a thing has with itself, a name, the name of something and the relationship it has with itself. The name Gabriel Garcia Marquez is certainly larger than a man with that name, born in such and such a year, who is from Colombia. There's a whole set of connotations and associations and relations that a word has essentially with itself. What has it come to represent? What has it come to symbolize? There is also obvious connections between names and descriptions. A word or a noun and a dependent appositive clause, which follows that provides some kind of description. Elena Poniatowska, the Mexican writer of Polish descent, who wrote Lilus Kikus. There's also relationships between different words or phrases which refer to the same thing. A consideration we should keep in mind while we're always doing translations is not only can this one thing have various meanings, but these various things can have the same meaning. And so, what's the relation between different names and descriptions? The United States of America, or Gringolandia, or as they say down here in Oaxaca, al otro lado, the other side. If you say the other side, one knows you're speaking of the United States of America. That phrase, the United States of America, and that phrase, al otro lado, the other side, have a real possibility of describing each other there. Not just simply words referring to the same thing, but their inherent description share something together. Let's keep in mind that translation and metaphor have essentially the same etymology. They mean the same thing. Translation means metaphor, and metaphor means translation. Translation comes from the Latin trans, which is across or over or beyond, and latus, the past participle of the Latin verb ferre. Just think of the word ferry in English and think transference share the same etymology with translation. The Latin traduco means to carry something from one place to another. Therefore, translation is carrying a word or idea from one place to another. Metaphor comes from the Greek meta, also meaning across or beyond or over, and pheron, which comes also from to carry, to ferry something, to bear something. Nietzsche says that, or describes metaphor as gleichmachen, make equal. I think though Nietzsche is actually here closer to defining symbol rather than metaphor. A symbol might be what Kripke calls a rigid designator. I think for me a symbol is an example of a rigid designator. It is fixed, it's closed, it is equal to something. Just think how often symbols are visual. The crucifix means Christianity. The dollar sign means the US dollar, or other countries also have dollar as a currency, and in that context, that dollar sign means their currency. Symbols are kind of fixed. Under most or all possible worlds, they mean the same thing. Metaphor, I think, is closer to what Kripke would call an accidental signifier, something that is looser, contingent, contextual, always connotative, always there, open to a variety of meanings and interpretations and explanations. I think at best translation is a kind of mirror image, the one text of the other, as Michel Foucault said, to see something there where it is not. Saussure, in the course in general linguistics, says that writing is not a guise for language, it's a disguise. Let's extend this metaphor from disguise all the way into clothing and say that words are essential. The translated word is essentially the clothing we hang upon the idea, we hang upon the body. The body is the same between the two languages. It's the clothing we put upon it that is the translated text. Translation is a kind of tailoring, to think of that analogy. You're nipping it, you're making it fit, you're opening it up, you're closing it in where necessary so that you get the best fit to that body. The body being not the words on the page of the original text, but the ideas and the concepts that are represented by those words on the page. In some ways, I think translation and definition and explanation are kinds of having a good peripheral vision, that you see beyond just what you're looking at. I see right now a camera there in front of me, but I also see all around me plants and trees and the blue sky above and a couple chairs over here and a tiled floor here. I see all of those things around the central focus that I have right now. There's all those things around it. And so to be a good translator, I think is in part having a kind of good vision of what you're looking at. I'd also, just to end here, want to kind of draw a comparison with a reading practice that I learned years and years and years ago when I first enrolled at the university. I took a couple of speed reading classes, and I don't know if I got so much out of them except for one really key idea, and that is to read a text down. When we think about translation, I said in an earlier video that the phrase or the sentence is the basic unit of translation. It's not the word. Now, a phrase can be a word. Sometimes a word is a phrase. Sometimes a word is a dependent clause or an independent clause. But it's not word by word by word that we're translating, but we're translating that sentence at a time, that phrase at a time. The most enjoyable, and I think the best translations that I've done is where I'm reading the text in Spanish and typing it in English at the same time. I'm seeing those texts there at the same time. I'm seeing the creation, I'm seeing the interpretation of this text while I recreate it or explain it in this text that I'm writing. To get back to that speed reading class example, when you read a text, instead of going word, 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 if you read a text line, the entire 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 line, etc., if you grasp that idea on that line and then the idea as it continues in the lines that follow, the block of words that follow, in arbitrary, line by line, an arbitrary set of words at a time, but a whole block of ideas, and move down the text that way. It takes a little practice, but when you do it, I think you have a fuller, richer, and more complete experience of reading the text. Next time we're going to take a closer look at some of the terms that Saul Kripke discusses in his book naming a necessity. Until then, read lots.